Jaws. Perhaps the best single-word title to encapsulate a film. You can hear the theme music playing as soon as someone says the words. Released in 1975, Jaws taught viewers to fear the water, and it set off a borderline mass hysteria over the threat of man-eating sharks nearing the shore with every oceanic wave. There's even a term named after the movie, the Jaws effect, coined by Dr. Christopher Neff 40 years after the movie released. All sharks became Jaws, ready to unleash their potential horror on every Amity Island stand-in. But not all shorelines are Amity, and perhaps this is where the real horror of Jaws lies. The island of Amity and its residents represent a community deliberately separated and segregated from outside influence. The once safe seas, standing as a border between islanders and non-islanders, is at once revealed and destroyed by the introduction of a great white shark that has found its way into their waters.
Nicole Neff, in The Belly of the Beast, the Uncanny Shark, claims that the shark is uncanny because it embodies broken boundaries. If horror is about the return of the repressed, then the shark is the danger of all that lies in the depths. It remains hidden under a surface that, when looked upon, only reveals a broken image of our reflection. Our fear of the unknown leads us to a desire for the intimacy of knowledge, here represented by Quint's violent destruction of the beast and Hooper's elbow-deep investigation of the false Jaws caught by the fishermen. But Jaws is not only about the shark. In 3 Men on a Boat, Jen Corrigan provides a queer reading of the film, in which she asks, is there really anything gayer than 3 men on a boat? As the relationship between Quint, Hooper, and Brody develops, we can ask questions about their bond, about performances of masculinity, and the value of shared wine and shared scars. Join us as we delve into the dangerous waters of Jaws and seek to navigate the choppy seas of analysis. Be careful, we may have bitten off more than we can chew.
Welcome to Horror Joy. I'm Jeff Stoyanoff, Assistant Professor of English at Penn State Altoona.
I'm Brian Onishi, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Penn State Altoona.
So Brian, Jaws. Why are we starting here?
I think that Jaws is such an iconic film. We have this theme music that's just incredible. I think most people can identify the theme music, even if you haven't seen the movie. It plays into so many of these structural narratives that we tell about outsiders, about the fear of the unknown, about the introduction of some monstrous thing, and our desires to either control it or destroy it. And so we have a sense in which we can think about this in terms of all kinds of ideological frameworks. And for me, one of the things that I think is interesting, and we'll get into this, is a kind of ecological approach. Why is it that we want to dominate the seas? Why is it that our knowledge is one that requires us to know in a violent manner the shark? But there's times when this movie is just kind of funny. It's well paced. The characters are great. The island itself is interesting as a thing. The mayor is so hateable. I think there's just something for everybody in this movie. And it's also something, when we think about horror, there are a lot of horror movies that just don't resonate with people. I think Jaws is one that is really accessible. It's accessible to folks that like horror, and it's accessible to folks that actually don't like horror. And I think that that makes it something worth talking about here, kind of at the beginning of our journey into horror joy. Yeah, but what about you, Jeff? What are your experiences with Jaws?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you talk about it as a film for folks who might not like horror, even though it is horror. I would guess a lot of folks don't even consider Jaws horror. They probably consider it this sort of age-old story of man versus nature, one of the central conflicts that sort of animates so much literature and so many stories. I'm thinking of Moby Dick. I'm thinking of Beowulf, actually, where one of Beowulf's first braggings is jumping into the sea and fighting all of the sea monsters and holding his breath for like 9,000 years. That's a little bit of hyperbole. I don't think he even goes that far. But I remember seeing Jaws as a kid on grainy VHS film, probably from a Blockbuster, and being terrified even though I'd never been to the ocean. it was this threat that I'm not saying it sort of deterred us from going to the ocean, but it was a sort of thing that we figured, oh, that's in the ocean and it's something that we need to be afraid of. And because we had no experience with the ocean, I think we assumed that the ocean was just filled with sharks. So this maybe goes back to the sort of Jaws effect that we talked about in the intro there, where even people who weren't near the water began to fear the water in ways that I'm sure weren't productive for the communities that relied on folks going to the beach. So as much as I really, 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 really disliked the townsfolks of Amity and sort of wanted the shark to win, frankly, maybe their fears were legitimate about what this would do to their industry of tourism, to their money making.
You yell shark, we've got a panic on our hands on the 4th of July.
If you've been to, I mean, I've been to the ocean in the interim, 30 years since seeing this movie for the first time. And when in the Outer Banks in North Carolina, for example, when you're down in that area, it is, if you're on like Ocracoke Island, there is something very kind of isolating. And also there's a kind of horror in the idea that it takes a ferry to get to an island. For me, as a land dweller, a landlubber, maybe as a pirate would say, having to take a ferry to get to an island is kind of scary because there is no direct connection back to the mainland. So there's got a lot of sort of horror that plays out with Jaws in that way. But yeah, there's this giant creature that we have no control over. We're on its turf, so to speak. And it has giant, sharp, nasty teeth.
This is a great white, Larry, a big one. And any shark expert in the world will tell you it's a killer. It's a man-eater.
What more could you ask for?
I like what you said there about not having an experience with the beach and yet still being afraid of it. And I think it parallels my experience with the Blair Witch Project, right? Again, I mean, there's woods in California, but it's not the same as in central Pennsylvania. And so there is this sense in which you can still fear and be afraid of that thing that's on screen, even when it's not really that close to you. And in some ways, that characterizes the thing for you. What's interesting for me is that my encounter with Jaws, especially early on, was almost exclusively through this tram ride at Universal Studios in Hollywood. And it scared me so much. And I will say that I don't know if it's because of this tram ride, but I have been fascinated with sea monsters my whole life. And that might be another reason why I love starting here, is because that experience of Jaws jumping out of that little pond on the tram ride in Universal scared me so much, right? I knew it was coming, and it still scared me. I think I didn't really see the movie until later in life, probably about 10 years ago. And I remember thinking, this is actually a really good movie. I think I was not expecting it. I was expecting something that was just really cheesy and silly. I think probably because of my memories of Universal. But I remember thinking it was a really, really good movie and touting it for that fact. And I think it stands up even now. There's lots of things we can talk about why it's outdated or whatever, but I think as a narrative, it still stands up. And as we're doing here, we're going to talk about through some of the most important stuff. The most recent time that I saw the movie, and this was just an incredibly fun experience, is I saw the movie at a drive-in that was right on the beach in New England. And that was just a really cool experience to kind of watch Jaws on the beach in New England and to experience it there. So I have these strong memories of Jaws from childhood up until very recently.
So I guess we can maybe start to think about how horror is working in Jaws. Let's start with the island. So we have this island community of Amity. We have this sort of natural boundary between the mainland of the United States, of New England, and then this community that is Amity with a natural border of the water. But suddenly then what they had been using as their sort of protection from the outside is no longer protecting them and instead has brought a threat of this great white shark. And so there's something to be said about potentially the uncanny at play here, where what was once familiar is now unfamiliar. This is sort of Freud's concept of things that seem very familiar to one being just dissimilar enough to sort of make your skin crawl. The best example I can think of when I'm teaching this sort of in a classroom is dolls. A lot of people find dolls to be incredibly uncanny because they are so lifelike in a way, and yet there is something that's just different enough that sort of sets you on edge. And so this boundary of the ocean suddenly becomes no longer safety and instead becomes danger. And I'm thinking about how this movie opens, right? Where we have the hippies. I don't know how to describe them. Young people having a party on the beach with like music and a fire in a barrel, like something that is so iconic for 70s movies. They show up just randomly. And I think it's interesting you assume this movie would be really cheesy before you saw it. I think in some ways, a lot of the movies that are spawned from a movie like Jaws are super cheesy, like Sharknado or something to that effect. But Jaws itself, when I was rewatching it recently, I was like, oh God, I don't remember it being this cheesy when it started, right? Now, it quickly gets away from that. But that opening scene is like just something straight out of the 70s. But all as we're brought into this scene, a bunch of young folks, very like blonde hair, blue-eyed, sort of just something out of a JCPenney catalog. They are having a party, they're drinking, they're having fun. It's night. There's someone playing guitar because there's always somebody playing a guitar. The young man makes eye contact with the young woman, and then she just sort of takes off running down the dunes in a strange way where I'm yelling, don't run on the dunes, because this is what happens when you get old. At this opening, no one really knows what's happening yet. We just see two young people kind of in drunken fun or drunken debauchery, whichever way you want to put it. So she gets to the ocean, decides to take her nighttime dip, and the guy can't even get undressed, just falls over right on the shoreline there. And she's out swimming in the moonlight, but then suddenly things take a massive turn. And we see the shark's perspective underwater, and it grabs her, and then she's being yanked every which way, and she's screaming. We don't actually get to see her killed on screen, but we see the results the next day. So what we find then is this woman who was killed wasn't from the island. She's an outsider. She is someone who has come in from the outside. She's a tourist, whatever. And so the leadership of the island don't seem to be that concerned with the idea that this outsider's been killed.
You're born here, right? Yeah, I'm an islander.
It's a boating accident. Brody, who is also an outsider, seems to be actually concerned about this, trying to explain that, wait a minute, there's something here we need to be concerned about. There's a sense of dramatic irony at play, where we understand something as the viewer that most of the characters on the screen either don't understand or they're unwilling to understand. And so there's horror working on a couple levels there. There's the horror of this giant man-eating shark in the waters, but there's also the horror of, oh God, they're not going to do anything, and this is just going to continue to happen. What do you think about these boundaries, Brian? What are your thoughts here?
There's so much to unpack here. I think because I'm a philosopher, I'm just like always happy to make distinctions. And the distinction that I find in genre fiction that is really helpful is that horror is about our world right now, but something is here that shouldn't be here. We can imagine a monster being in a kind of fantasy world, and that's just where it lives, right? The ogre lives there in the fantasy world, and that's fine. That's not our world. But the monster being in our world makes it horrific. And so I think the borders and the boundaries that we're talking about here is exactly what you're saying, right where the horror of Jaws lies. Jaws, as the shark, should not be here. It should not be disrupting this kind of Amityville summer, and therefore it is horrific. So I think that there's something really compelling about the fact that every time that we go under the water, we break the boundary of the water, we are confronted with the shark. And there's something, like you said, that's scary about that. We can't see down there very clearly. And once we enter that area, we are in the shark's world. We are much less prepared to be a thriving thing in the water than the shark is. The scene on the dunes is so weird. I'm with you. The clumsy chase, I think, could be a way of thinking about all of the ways that a clumsy chase continues to happen in the film. The mayor demanding tourists have fun at the beach is kind of a clumsy chase after their money or them as a commodity. But the three men on the boat, right? They also in some way clumsily chase after the shark. I think that there's really something interesting about Amity itself as being separated from the rest of the world in some way. They're on an island, and so the ocean acts as a boundary from the outside. And so I guess one thing that I think is interesting to talk about is what is being protected on Amity. We get this sense in which the island itself seems to be fairly homogeneous, right? So when you watched it, did you see the island or really the ocean as a boundary of safety from any outside influences? That is to say, is it protecting the homogeneity of the island itself and the community there?
Yeah, exactly. It's an incredibly insular community. They sort of brag about it. Like there's the scene on the beach with Brody's wife.
When do I get to become an islander?
And one of the local business owners, another woman who I think she owns a hotel. And Brody's wife is talking about how they just moved there. They're starting to feel like part of the community. And this woman responds, "Oh, if you're not from here, you never will be from here."
You're not born here, you're not an islander. Maybe that's it.
Like they are very proud of this idea of you're either an islander or you're not an islander. But at the same time, these folks depend on the mainland for their main industry, which, I mean, Quint maybe is a throwback to what their industry could have been years ago with like fishing, but now it's tourism because they are an island. And so they are by definition surrounded by water. So there are beaches on every side of the island. There is that scene when they decide to go forward, right, with the 4th of July festivities, and this giant ferry is coming from the mainland. And this is the first time you see this introduction of people who aren't just like pasty-faced, white, blue-eyed, blonde-haired people, or like, the sort of definition of right out of the dictionary, a picture of a snowbird, someone like just these older folks that are just like super tan. But then you have suddenly some like diversity coming from the outside. So there is that very real implication too about sort of almost a purity that's on the island. It's reminiscent of, I mean, you see this in other horror movies too, where there are sort of the outsiders versus the people who live there, whether it's like the village or something like that. But there seems to be this idea then of the island, and the islanders view themselves as an authority of deciding like who is what and who gets to be what. And with that, this is sort of thinking about boundaries, thinking about sort of makes me think about surveillance. And we might look at Foucault's idea of the panopticon, where the idea of if you're on an island, you kind of can pivot. I mean, a lighthouse is a really good example of this, actually, how you can look around every which way to sort of see what's around you and look out into the ocean and sort of discern attacks, if you will, before they're coming. The shark undermines that because the shark is under the water and you can't see the shark. And suddenly there's this flip then where what they thought was this ability to observe what's happening, the water sort of keeps them at a distance between what's coming versus what's there. Suddenly they can't do that. And maybe it's now the shark that as it circles the island, as it circles the shoreline, is the thing surveilling them. And this is something they can't seem to wrap their heads around and they can't come to grips with. And so this is in some ways then what leads us into the idea of the hunt for the shark. And I like this idea of clumsy because the whole thing is just super clumsy. I mean, it reminds you of a bunch of, from where I grew up, it reminds you of a bunch of guys just getting in a pickup truck with a gun saying, we're gonna go take care of things. And you're like, this is not gonna end well.
They're all gonna die.
I mean, there's the great scene, right? Where there's the two old guys on the dock and they get the roasts out of the one guy's wife's freezer and they throw this anchor, this tire out into the water, trying to go fishing. Like they're just fishing for like, I don't know, some sort of smaller game fish off the dock. And they do catch Jaws, but it catches them really because it's dragging him into the water on the broken dock. And I think in some ways that broken dock is so symbolic of all of Amity because it is old and decaying and there's something really rotten at its core.
Yeah, I think there's so much to unpack here. And so if we were to talk about power relations, I think this is really important. So you talked about Foucault and you talked about the panopticon, and we have a flip in surveillance. And that's really important because not only do we have the island surveilling, which we see when the shark becomes a threat, but we have Brody as the image of surveillance in some way via being a police officer. But he's been stripped of power. He's tried to close the beach and the mayor has stripped him of power. And one thing that I think happens is when the border or the boundary is broken by the tourists coming in, there's a desire to keep a power structure in such a way that the tourists are commodities, right? They are commodified. And so we can sacrifice them. We sacrifice the first woman who dies on the beach. We sacrifice the tourist. That's totally fine because they're not really people. They're just being seen as objects or commodities. And I think that scene where those guys on the dock are trying to catch Jaws is indicative of that clumsy kind of hunt. They have been seduced out to the dock by the hunt, maybe, but also by the $3,000 reward, and they've done it really poorly. And they've let themselves be seduced into a sense of danger. I think it highlights that first kind of scene as setting up the structure of this film. I also think when you think about boundaries and borders and you think about what is safe and what is not safe, it does seem as though we get in Brody this idea of the homogenous island, and really we can say the straight, white, cisgendered, heterosexual island, that homogenous community is safe. One time Brody is on the boat with Hooper and he's drunk and he says, you know what? The crime rates in New York will kill you. You come here, you can make a difference. There's no crime. It is safe, and I can make a difference.
Telling you the crime rate in New York will kill you. But in Amity, one man can make a difference.
And I think that there's some stark contrast between the city as dangerous, and as we see when the tourists come in, as diverse, that's a kind of danger. So when we think about Jaws, we can kind of also think about it as a means of thinking through all kinds of class issues, race issues, the distinction between us and them, and how that boundary and border is set up as safety and then breaks down as horror. And I think the Jaws breaking through that is in some way part of the horror. It's not only breaking through the surface of the ocean, it's also breaking through the homogeneity of the island and requiring the island to see themselves in the way that maybe an outsider would see them. And I think that's really important.
I would agree with what you're saying there, and I think we get that horror through Brody, and then we get it again through Hooper. When Hooper comes to the island as an outsider too, as a scientist though, like an oceanographer from the Oceanographic Institute, he is horrified that people aren't taking this seriously. He is a man of science. He is a man that studies these things, and he has all of this knowledge. He also comes from wealth, and so he's probably used to people not questioning him and used to like just sort of being able to do what he wants. And this becomes sort of some contention between him and Quint later. But his horror is like realizing that there's something here that shouldn't be here. Like there is something here scientifically that doesn't belong beyond just sort of the horror of there is a shark in the water that is threatening the tourism, that is threatening the sort of almighty dollar of capitalism for the folks of the island. But Hooper's also this outsider. And so it is interesting in thinking about how we have Brody as an outsider, Hooper is an outsider, and then Quint, who is a self-cast outsider that makes up the majority of the film, like the relationship the three of them have on the boat, or at least the majority of the action part of the film, as they are, as you said, continuing this clumsy hunt, each of them with their own expectations. Brody with the idea that nothing bad happens here. Hooper with sort of idea that I know science and science can solve everything, and Quint with his grizzled old sort of seafaring pirate shanty singing Irish brogue somehow in New England, deciding that he knows what he's doing because he, we see in his little shack on the edge of town that he's boiling shark jaws just because, like, that's a power move, isn't it? Like, you just walk in and there's a guy boiling shark jaws, and this is supposed to show us as the viewers that this guy he's an expert. He has shark jaws. He must know what he's doing.
That's right. And I think this is a good transition to the next topic here, is that when they go to his house, he hands them this homemade liquor, this bootleg stuff, and he's like, here, drink this. And Brody takes a drink and he's like, nope, Hooper, don't drink that. That's not what we do. We're not those guys, right? I think that in the power dynamic between those three, and I like what you're saying, they're all outsiders, and so they're all thrust together. But when they're thrust together, we also see the sense of who's inside and who's outside, right? Quint thinks of himself as the insider. he's going out into the ocean where he probably feels the most comfortable. And so what does he do? He sets up tests for especially Hooper. And I think what this does is in some way it challenges Hooper's masculinity, right? So we can kind of talk about the performance of masculinity out on the boat and how this relates to both the boundaries we've already talked about, but how the three of them interact with each other. So they perform, and I think this starts with Quint. And at one point, Hooper says, I don't need this working class hero, bit or whatever. And I think Hooper is trying to reject that. Like you're saying, he's the person of science. He's the person who's saying, like, we've got facts, we've got instruments, etc. Quint is saying, I know the shark, I know the seas. So I don't know. What do you think about the dynamic of the three men on a boat and how they perform masculinity, and whether or not that is a reinforcement of our understanding of masculinity, or does it challenge masculinity, especially in 1975?
Yeah, I'm thinking of Judith Butler here with her whole concept of gender as performance. And this is not to say that, like, from our perspective as viewers, these three characters are all pretty objectively identifiable as male. But each of them performs maleness, if you will, masculinity, in a way that seems to fit for them. So you talked about Brody before being from the city. He very much has like this sort of cop from the city beat masculinity about him. Gruff, a bit of an aloof father. Hooper is like, maybe the equivalent of like a 1970s metrosexual in a strange way. Like he comes in and he's like wearing his fancy clothes, and it's very much to sort of mark him as an outsider compared to the Islanders.
Quint mentions his hat as being really expensive or something like that at one point.
Right. It's very like, it's a conspicuous consumption sort of idea here where he's showing off his wealth. But yeah, Hooper's like, he's a man of learning, a man of intellect. That's what masculinity means to him. He's going to show that I am smart, and therefore in my evolved intelligence going to think my way through this rationally to figure out how do we deal with a giant shark. Quint, on the other hand, is like this very old school type of masculinity where it's violent. It's kind of hyper-masculine at times. It's interesting that we see Hooper engage him in that when they're drinking the one night with the sort of scar off, where they're going to talk about different scars. And, they're showing, I got this scar here, I got this scar there. And Hooper sort of crosses this line where he challenges Quint about what's that scar on his arm. And we get this sort of backstory about Quint, where it turns out that it's actually a tattoo he had removed that sort of marked him as being a member of the USS Indianapolis. And then we get this long, horrific story within a story about sharks that gives Hooper and Brody pause even. They're both sort of just like stuck here and watching this man relive this horrific incident that in 1975, when this movie released, is probably going to be still in the minds of a lot of folks. World War II. I mean, this is the greatest generation, and there's so much theory that goes into that as well, and how it's something we just can't really ever get away from. So that's brought in here. That's brought into part of the horror.
I do think that that's also part of the performance of masculinity there, is he was in the war, and so that gives him some credibility. And I think that this scene is incredible, the one that you just described, where they're sharing their scars. And I think that this is when the boundaries between the men start to break down too. And I think it's really interesting that it happens via the maps of their bodies, right? So they say, look at my body. This is how I've been opened onto the world. And the other respondent says, yeah, look at this. I've also been wounded and opened onto the world. And the boundary between my body and the world has been broken through this wound. And in some way, the boundary between the men also break down. And it's interesting because I think that doesn't usually happen explicitly, where, especially in 1975, the way that men are bonding are saying, look at my body. I mean, in some way it happens through sports, I suppose, but here they're saying, I'm gonna show you something, and I need you to look at it, and I need you to recognize me as somebody who's been through something.
I wonder to what you're saying there is if this where we might look at the sea both as boundary and as liminal space too. The space of liminality where the sort of normal rules and norms are paused. they're put into suspension when they can talk about their bodies, and how, frankly, I'm thinking back to the Corrigan quote about, is there really anything gayer than three men on a boat, which is kind of hilarious. But they're literally talking about how they've been penetrated by sort of these creatures from the sea, how that has like left marks on their body. And it is interesting that Hooper and Quint are really engaged in this conversation, but Brody is not part of it. Brody is, again, like, this is why I called him the consummate outsider earlier, because even in this, like, they are getting closer, you're right. And eventually, like, we see Brody learning things as they go, whether it's the oxygen tanks, or it's the tying of the knots, or it's bailing out water, or chumming the sea. And just that really iconic scene where he has the cigarette hanging out the side of his mouth, and the shark comes up.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
And interestingly, that's sort of that surveillance part of him that's still going. Like, he's always kind of watching in that way.
If that's true, it goes to the point that I think you're making, that Quint and Hooper have both been penetrated by the sea as they've penetrated the sea, but Brody has not, right? He's outside of this conversation because he's just not had the experience. He does have trauma, he does have wounds, but they're not from the sea. And that kind of sets him outside a little bit. I don't know if we want to circle back here, but I think there's an overlap here too with the way that both Hooper and Quint approach the shark. In some way, they have these very different perspectives, like you were saying, the kind of old fisherman versus the young scientist. But in my head, when I read this or when I see this, there's some common sense of dominating whatever is not human. So Quint wants to do this by literally capturing and showcasing what he's done. I've caught these sharks before. I'm boiling the jaws of previous catches, etc. Whereas Hooper is doing this through scientific investigation. Before they get to the ocean, they go to the false jaws, the tiger shark, and he opens it up, right? And he's penetrating the shark there in a way that he wants to reveal. There's a sense in which the revelation by scientific fact is in some way a kind of domination of the sea. What do we need? We need to know more. Why do we need to know more? So that we can better capture and dominate the sea. He wants to put the tracker in the shark right at one point and gets distracted from the overall goal, which is to keep people on the island safe or whatever. And I think this is where the kind of ecological impact of Jaws comes in, is when we see whatever is not human as something to be dominated, it becomes just like the tourists on the island. It becomes a commodity. We need to use this, just like Quint has done for most of his life, as a means to an end, which is to say we need to be able to use this for knowledge, for the production of capital via tourism, or just via the resources that we get from it. The fishing industry, right, that I think that Quint represents. And there's another sense in which Brody also is trying to dominate the ocean, but in the clumsiest way possible, when he literally shoots his gun just into the ocean. And so again, he remains on the outside. But this kind of last ecological point here is that it seems as though we can at least analyze the mode of interaction with the island and with Jaws as something that needs to be dominated. And I'm curious, I don't know, what do you think? Like, in terms of who's responsible, we're, I think, in some way supposed to think of Jaws as the enemy, but it's hard to imagine Jaws as responsible, right? So is there a sense of responsibility that we can identify here, maybe in ethical terms, but just generally? Like, can we hold the shark responsible for what it's doing?
You know the thing about a shark, he's got lifeless eyes, black eyes, like a doll's eyes. When he comes at you, doesn't seem to be living until he bites you.
Maybe back to our question, why start with Jaws? It's like meta horror. Like, there is horror within horror within horror in this movie, maybe more so now for those of us watching it in 2024 than for the original audiences in 1975, because now, maybe aligning ourselves with Hooper a bit here, as people of science, we understand that there is a reason that shark is there.
Proves that you wealthy college boys don't have the education enough to admit when you're wrong.
It should not be there. It does not belong there. And it's not just an act of God that means the shark is there. It's probably been displaced in some way. And so, yeah, there is a lot of ecological horror to unpack here, not the least of which is the shark shouldn't be here. Why is this shark here? What has led this shark to be here? What sort of human impacts have moved this shark here? Is it that its food source has been disrupted from fishing and therefore it is seeking out new waters? Is it that the waters are warming and therefore its typical migration paths have changed? Is it just building or development of the sea that has made its previous home uninhabitable or pollution, and therefore it has come to this area, which is essentially presented to us as pristine and pure in its islandic form? And so then this shark, too, is trying to take in the benefit of clean water, food, and a place where it can live. But it's a shark, so it's not allowed to do that because, of course, humans are happiness, our prosperity comes at the expense of everything else. We're not good stewards.
Yeah, I love that. We're not good stewards. You're right. And I love that because I think it really brings home the point that the shark is not responsible. And in many ways, we should root for the shark.
100%. I am team shark over and over.
That's right. All right, let's wrap up. So we've talked about how Jaws gives us insight to at least 3 different things. One, we can talk about the boundaries between self and other, between safe and danger, that's represented by the sea. And this is where the horror of Jaws breaks through. We have the relationship between the 3 men, Brody, Hooper, and Quint, the performance of masculinity that occurs out on the ocean. And maybe that's where, as a liminal space, some of these kinds of performances can break down. We also have ecological impacts, whereby the problem of the shark itself has been created by humans, and humans, as trying to dominate the ocean, are just exacerbating that problem. And there's this ecological kind of thing that we can point to in Jaws, whereby we see an analysis of our understanding of nature as one of domination. But also we have to realize that we can turn that kind of lens back on us. We're responsible for this. How do we therefore act? Any final thoughts on Jaws?
Yeah, I'll just maybe point us to the final scene of the movie where I think that last point you just made is lost on Hooper and Brody, where they're just so happy to be alive.
I think the tide's with us.
Keep kicking.
They're so happy to be with each other. Maybe back to our sort of queer reading here. And it's just laughter at the end, and they never make it back to the island, and they're just in the water sort of doggy paddling the whole way back to shore.
And Quint has just died, which I think goes to your point, which it's like, oh, the joy of horror is that it didn't happen to us. We didn't die. We're laughing here.
Right. Yeah. And I think it maybe sort of the horror is compounded yet again because they haven't learned anything from it.
Yeah, I think that's good. That's really good. This has been an episode of Horror Joy, produced in conjunction with Axis Mundi Media. Thanks for joining us. We want to hear from you. You can find us at Horror Joy Pod on Instagram or at Horror Joy Pod on YouTube. You can also email us at horrorjoypod@gmail.com, all one word. And you can, of course, find us wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a like, subscribe, leave a review. Until next time, remember, seek joy, even in horror.